Councillor Austin, you're not muted at the moment, so we can.
I've just muted.
Right, I'm not.
You are muted now, Councillor Austin.
Sorry, that was me.
Are we good to go, Jeanette?
I'm just double checking, Chairman.
You are, Jeanette. It's ready to go.
Yes, we're streaming live now, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good evening, councillors, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first virtual meeting of the Audit and Government Committee for Boston Borough Council. Before the meeting starts, can I ask that a roll call be taken of members and officers attending? And I shall hand over to Jeanette to do that, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll call members' names in alphabetical order. If you could just indicate you are present. Councillor Alison Austin.
Present.
Councillor David Brown.
Present, Jeanette.
Thank you. Councillor George Corner.
Present.
Councillor Anton Danny.
Present.
Councillor Anne Dorian.
Present.
Councillor Frank Pickett.
Present.
Councillor Peter Watson.
Present.
And lay member Mr Alan Pickering. Alan Pickering.
Sorry, I was muted. Present.
I can see you present, Alan. Yeah, thank you. The officers are the monitoring officer, Michelle Sachs. Thank you.
Present, thank you, Jeanette.
Thank you. The Section 151 officer, Adrian Sibley.
Present.
Mark Surridge, external auditor. Just waiting for him.
Harley's dialing in.
Oh, is he? Right, thank you.
Dialing in as we speak.
Great. John Scott, internal audit manager.
Yep, present.
Paul Berry, principal internal audit officer. Thank you. And we have John Rowley and Kay Acast from M&G, representing M&G UK Property Fund. Mrs. Acast?
Yes, present.
And Mr. Rowley?
Yes, present. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes. Oh, we also have Tim Sampson. I do beg your pardon.
Present,
are you
Jeanette.
present, Tim?
Present, yeah.
Thank you. That completes the roll call, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Could you also please make me a co-host on the Zoom so that I can see hands when they go up, please?
Yes, of course. Sorry, I forgot to do that.
Thank you very much.
No.
Appreciating that this is the first meeting that we've held at the Audit and Government Committee for some time, and also the first that we've held on Zoom, I'll move to part one of our agenda, which is the preliminaries, and those are the minutes from the 27th of January 2020. Have I the committee's permission to sign those minutes? And if you have any comments, please use the raised hand facility. If there are no comments, I will assume that you are in agreement for me to sign those minutes when I'm able to do so, or that an electronic signature is put in there on my behalf. We'll just give you a moment if anyone has anything to say. I don't see any. Councillor Austin. Councillor Austin, please.
I would abstain because I wasn't on the committee at that stage.
Thank you very much, Councillor Austin. That's certainly noted, and I will just add a word of welcome to you for joining this committee this evening. So thank you very much for that. Seeing that there are no further hands, I will take it that you are content for me to sign those minutes and move on to item B, which is, are there any apologies?
Yes, Chairman, there's apologies from Councillor Martin Howard.
Thank you. And could I also ask if there are any members who have an interest to declare in respect of items on this evening's agenda, please? Seeing none, if there's anything that comes up during the course of a meeting, please indicate and we will note that at that point. D, are there any questions from members of the public?
There are none, Chairman.
Thank you, Jeanette. So we move on to part 2 of our agenda, which is the principal agenda items, and that's the fund manager presentation. Could I just ask who is presenting this particular report? Because I did just. Sorry,
that will be myself. My name is Kate Acast, and I'm the manager responsible for investor relations in the UK Property Fund. And I shall be joined by John Rowley, who is manager.
thank you very much. Welcome to both of you. Apologies, I had some scribblings on my paper as to who was just presenting this. So thank you very much, and I shall hand over to you now for you to deliver your presentation, if that's okay with you, please.
Chairman,
Thank you very much.
Could I just ask Mrs. Acast, do you wish me to share the screen and show the PDF file that you forwarded?
Yes, please, Jeanette, that'd be very helpful.
Hopefully everyone can see that.
So firstly, yes, I think so. So firstly, I would like to say thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present to you this evening. We were very disappointed that it wasn't possible for us to travel up to Boston to meet you in person today, but we very much hope that this is something we may be able to do in the not too distant future. So during our presentation this evening, we will be providing an update on the real estate market, as well as the fund in which you're invested, and our views on the outlook moving forwards. We will be happy to answer any questions you might have as we go through our presentation, so please do not hesitate to stop us and raise a question if you would like to. So Jeanette, could we move on to slide 5 or page 5? So I'm going to start by giving you a very brief overview of the team that's responsible for managing your investment. John Rowley is the fund manager. He took over managing this fund in August. He's a highly experienced and very capable manager and brings with him over 30 years of experience in UK markets. During his tenure at M&G, he has built up a very impressive track record of outperformance on the funds he's managed. This includes, in the past, he managed a UK mandate between 2013 and 2016, which was ranked #1 in its benchmark index in terms of its performance. And that was as a result of delivering very strong returns as we came out of the global financial crisis. He's also responsible for another internal UK property fund, which he's managed since 2016. And under his leadership, this has grown from a 350 million portfolio, which was made up of 17 assets, to over $1 billion with 48 assets today. So as you can see, there's been some significant growth achieved there. So in terms of the investment team, the overall structure has largely remained unchanged since you came into the fund back in August 2018. So John is responsible for setting the overall strategy of the fund and directing the specialist investment and asset managers in executing the strategy. There's also a 10-strong research team that supports John, and that's led in the UK by Anata Wyack, and as well as a dedicated sustainability team who provide guidance on the execution of the fund's responsible property investment strategy, which, as I'm sure you're all aware, is becoming an increasingly important factor and source of outperformance. Because John has retained his responsibility for the other portfolio he manages, we will be adding a deputy fund manager to the team who's going to be providing additional support. We are hoping to place an internal candidate into this role, and we currently have 4 very strong candidates who we are going through the interview process with, so we should be able to announce who this person will be very soon. As you can see also on the slide, we show the wider teams that support the investment team within the business. Are there any questions at this stage? Okay, I shall take that as a no, and I will hand over to John now, who's going to talk a bit about the market. Jeanette, could you move to page 7, please?
Thank you, Kay. Good evening, everybody. Very nice to meet you over Zoom. So just a few slides here on the property market. Conscious of time here, of course, your valuable time. So not wishing to dwell on too much of the detail, but here we have a slide that shows property returns over time. As you can see in the header there, the key point I wanted to make is that total returns turned positive for the 3 months to September 2020, so 0.7% positive total return. As you can see, we had some negative returns post the onset of COVID in March 2020. In fact, capital returns remain negative across all sectors except industrial for Q3. And we have seen a reduction in property valuations of about 6.7% since the onset of the pandemic in March, as I say. The probably interesting point is that most of that decline happened up to the point of June, and we've seen relatively sort of benign changes since June in those valuations as the lockdown, the initial lockdown eased and the market started to open up again. Turning to the next slide, Jeanette. We include this slide, which is looking at the yield spread for property over bonds, just to kind of see where we think the relative value of property sits relative to bonds. And as you can see from the right-hand side of the chart, we've got the yield premium over gilts in the green and the light green, and yield premium over corporate bonds. And both of those are essentially at record highs going back to 2000. The spread over bonds is 6.2%, and the spread over corporate bonds is 3.7%. In these terms, it's showing real estate as relatively attractive at this point in time. Moving forward, Jeanette, if possible. So, fairly simplistic chart here showing you the turnover of transactions in the investment market across 4 different sectors of real estate here over time. And as you can see, 2020 year to date there, which is at about 31 billion, is somewhat off the historic past. The 10-year average is about 50 billion of transactions. Clearly, we have the remainder of the year, another quarter to go. So actually, that transaction activity, doesn't look too bad in the, in view of the pandemic that we've all gone through and are still suffering with. Jeanette, the next slide would be great. So in terms of kind of how the values of properties are adjusted over time, these two charts kind of help us explain that. On the left-hand side, it shows the change in rental value for assets. So, for example, if you look at the red line for retail, you can see that that is suffering negative rental growth. So the value of the rents that you can achieve from retail is declining. And then on the right-hand side, we have the yield component of value. So the rate of return an investor is prepared to accept or pay for an asset. And as you can see, that has been increasing for retail. A higher yield generates a lower value. So this really is to explain the contrasting fortunes of the different property sectors. So retail has been declining in value, as you will probably be aware, whereas industrial has been sort of that net benefiter of the change in the retail environment and the way we tend to all look to shop these days, or the greater influence of online retail. So industrial has seen positive rental growth and continues to do so. And the yield, whilst increasing a little bit during the COVID period, particularly the lockdown element of the COVID period, has seen a resurgence in value and a lowering in yield since the lockdown was eased. So pricing is generally at or about where it was prior to the lockdown period. So very strong and robust performance by industrial. So I was going to leave it there for the property market, and conscious of the time of everybody, but if there are questions on the property market, we could take those now, or if they arise later, we can pick them up then.
If anyone has any questions that they'd like to raise at this time, please raise your hand in the Zoom fashion and ask. Councillor Watson. Go ahead, Councillor Watson. You're muted at the moment.
Thank you, Chairman. Just like to ask, and Kay mentioned this in the previous page, strategy of this fund. Could I possibly ask what is the exact strategy of this fund? Thank you.
Yes, and we do have slides covering that later, but a key strategy for the fund would be to reduce its retail exposure. It does sit on a slightly long exposure relative to its benchmark peers. So that would be a key focus for me as fund manager going forward, as well as building up in time exposure to alternative sectors, or the other sector, as we sometimes call it. So private residential, hotel, and other styles of investment like that.
Thank you. And if I may, Chairman, so is there a strategy set out as by when people join this fund, or organisations such as ours join this fund, as to what the overall intentions are of the fund? So such as a mixture of residential, industrial property, etc. That's really what I'm after. Thank you.
Yes, sorry. Apologies, I didn't get to your question or the answer you required. I think
that's fine. That's okay.
It's set out as a balanced fund, as we call it. So it would tend to have exposure to all the main sectors, as well as those alternative sectors, and it would seek to be at or around the benchmark level of exposure in each of those individual property types and sectors, taking sort of tactical bets around those depending upon our particular views on those real estate sectors.
So maybe if I could ask, are you still true to label, considering you are changing the asset mix due to the current pandemic?
I think we are very much true to label. As you may see in a couple of slides further on, to some extent we are fairly away from the benchmark level at this point in time. There's a fairly significant diversion away from it, and part of my role is to resolve that to some degree and bring us back into sort of a market position.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got Mr. Sibley wanting to come in. What I'll say is I think it would probably be helpful if we run through the rest of the presentation and then do the questions. I'm just conscious that I think there are things that members might want to ask at this stage that you may very well answer in the next one. But Mr. Sibley, if you'd like to speak, please.
I'm happy to wait till the end, Chair. My question isn't specific to this, but generally, so I'm happy to wait till the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you. If you'd like to carry on with the next stages of the presentation, please.
Okay, you're on mute.
Apologies. Jeanette, would you be able to move to page 12 now, please? Thank you very much. So this is just providing an overview of the fund today. So the fund size currently stands at approximately 470 million. It's comprised of 31 assets with 55 underlying investors. And a key statistic here is the fund's vacancy rate, which currently stands at 1.3. This is extremely low, particularly in comparison to the benchmark, which the benchmark level is currently 9%. And interestingly, it's actually lower than when you first came into the fund, when it stood at 2.5%. So this really does illustrate the quality of the fund's tenants, and that we've been able to keep exposure to defaults and CVAs very low. And John will talk about this in a little bit more detail shortly. So the long-term target return, whilst that looks quite ambitious at the moment, that does remain our target over the long term. And our target distribution yield also remains at +4%. This has become more challenging since the outbreak of COVID, but we were able to pretty much maintain distribution levels during the first half of this year, although Q3 has come down about 0.3%. But as we move forward and make progress with our rent collections, we would be hoping for this to improve at some point in the future. And just on the right, we've got some pictures here showing the types of assets that the fund holds. They are all very good quality assets in very strong locations. So just here we have got an office in Manchester, we have got student accommodation in Edinburgh, as well as some retail warehouse and industrial assets. So just to give you a sort of flavour for the sort of assets the property holds. I think probably I'm going to pass you back to John now, who's going to talk a little bit more about the strategy and the fund characteristics.
Thank you. So just moving to the next slide, please, Jeanette. So this is touching on 4 key points for mine and the investment and the fund's investment strategy. As it says in the subtitle, there are no changes to key objectives since I inherited the fund from Dermot Kiernan. I will have a strong focus on income, and as Kay highlighted there, looking to maintain that 4% distribution yield. Structural wise, clearly we want to ensure we've got a well-diversified portfolio with retained assets of a high quality. And as we mentioned earlier, we do also want to bring that structural position from a sectoral perspective, particularly retail, more into line, if not go underweight, particularly retail, for example. Active management is one of the key ways that we certainly do provide that income return that I referred to in the top bullet. So that's something we've got the team that Kay highlighted, and we spend a lot of time trying to add value from a strong pipeline of asset initiatives. Just highlight here particularly the rural portfolio that sits in the fund. So that is something that we hope to see sort of significant value add from over time as those strategic land initiatives come to the fore. And as Kay mentioned, lastly there, our sustainability credentials are very, very, very important to us, and we will be focusing very heavily in that regard, particularly with respect to our 2050 net zero carbon commitment for the fund. Just briefly, in case we don't get to the later slides, I will mention that we are looking at an earlier point in time for a net neutral operational target in terms of carbon. So that's something we'll share with you in due course when we've set that target. Moving to performance on the next slide. So I really want you to focus on the top chart here, the rolling performance, which gives you a good number of metrics over time. You can see since inception on the right-hand side that the fund has a good performance, outperforming the benchmark 6.3 versus 6.2. In those sort of intervening periods, 12 months, 3 years and 5 years, there has been some underperformance, as you can see there, but we are seeing an uptick in performance at the moment. So if you look at the 3-month return for Q3, we're showing 0.6 for the fund versus 0.2 for the benchmark, so 3 basis points of outperformance. That's on the back of a similar relative return performance in Q2 as well, so another 40 basis points of outperformance there. So as I inherit this fund, I'm hoping that we're seeing one of the things that we've been saying for a while now is coming true, which is that we felt the valuers on this fund were taking a very prudent approach to the values that they applied to the assets in the fund, perhaps more prudent than the benchmark average valuer. And I think to some extent we can see that coming true with these more recent relative outperformance numbers against the benchmark. But 2 quarters doesn't make a full story, so let's see how that pans out in the coming quarters. We have included here a couple of comments on your specific returns in the bottom sort of green box, which does show a negative 3.3% per annum performance since September 18, and total income distributions paid of 300,000. I suppose the only things I would mention there, and it's not for me to say necessarily, but the returns on other investment classes have been significantly worse than that 3.3% negative return over that same period. So I think property is showing its sort of relative stability over that period, if you were to ask me. On the next slide, please, Jeanette. So we're getting a bit more into the sort of nitty-gritty, the detail of the fund here, and this is a topic, rent collections, which has been very much on our agenda this year, particularly from Q2, as you can see there on the left-hand side. Given the onset of the pandemic, I mean, usually this fund would be collecting 95 to 100% of its rent without problem. But with the onset of the pandemic and a government moratorium on being able to take aggressive actions with relation to rent collection, such as forfeiting leases, tenants have taken advantage of that and been very slow to pay or not paid their rents at all. We have in this fund some quite significant tenants who haven't paid at all over that period from Q2. So I think the encouraging thing to say here is that very recently, despite that moratorium still being in place from the government, we have been able to come to some solutions with those tenants, and you should see a very significant uptick in these rental collection statistics. From about 70-75% I'm showing here for Q2, Q3. These should jump well up towards the sort of 85 to 90% level, with hopefully further collections to come. Q4 just jumping in there, showing at 55%. This is a timing issue. This data is only sort of 4 weeks after the charge date for Q4, whereas the other 2 quarters have obviously had plenty more time to improve the collection stats. At the same time, this quarter, for those prior quarters, the rent collections were actually lower than 55%. So you could argue there is a slightly improving trend with that statistic that we're showing at 55%. Just moving on to the next slide. As this is, I won't touch on this too much because Kay did mention the very limited exposure to retail CVAs and administrations. So clearly that's one way the fund stays reasonably well occupied, is that we don't have this situation where tenants give up their premises through these 2 methods. So you can just see that about 1.2% of the rent roll is impacted in Q3 2020, with those 3 tenants listed on the right hand side being in either a CVA situation or an administration. On the next slide, we included this slide particularly because we thought you were interested in how we manage risks in this fund. And this is a very complicated slide, so I won't dwell on it for too long. But what it goes to do is look at the income profile for the fund. So particularly on the left-hand side, it's looking at what's called covenant here, which is credit quality of the tenants in the portfolio. And then on the right-hand side of the circle, it's looking at kind of the lease structures that we have. So the length of leases, how far away are the lease expiry dates in the portfolio? What's the vacancy rate look like? And what's something called over-renting, which is essentially a tenant is paying more than the market rent. So if that tenant were to leave, you would see a decline in rental income to the new market level. Generally, all I want to say here is that I'm targeting the dark green to be in the top quartile ranking against the benchmark. And you can see that we are in that dark green for 5 of these segments. So a little work to do on the other segments, but I'm reasonably relaxed about the statistics that do sit within those less than top quartile segments. On the next slide. So as referred to earlier, we're providing here how we're managing the fund from a sector allocation perspective across the sort of 4 main food groups for real estate. And as you can see at the bottom bar, this is the portfolio at June. If we just pick out the retail element in the light blue, we have 34% retail versus the benchmark in the line above at 24%. So that's a key aspect for me in managing this fund, to bring that into line. And as you'll see from the line above, I actually I'm targeting to bring that to an underweight retail exposure through rebalancing the portfolio, mainly through a sales program that I'm undertaking to meet a certain level of redemptions that exist within the fund. Kay will talk about those redemptions in a few minutes. As you can see, funded in a good position industrial-wise, probably the strongest performing sector, so 36% versus the benchmark of 33%. And we intend to stay long to that, as you will see. Office-wise, we're very short at 18% versus the benchmark. And I quite like that position, given where we're all working from today, all the debates about, the future of the office. I think, this fund is in a particularly safe position with respect to that future outcome. And in fact, could take advantage of any distress in the market around office accommodation. And alternatives, which is our rural portfolio mainly, plus the student accommodation in Edinburgh, we see that growing over time for this fund. So as mentioned, the next slide does give you an update on the deferral, as we call it. Kay is going to pick up on this.
Thank you, John. So, yeah, as John mentioned, the fund does have a number of mature pension scheme investors who are looking to de-risk as their schemes mature. So in order to allow time for John to raise the necessary liquidity to do this, we invoked what are known as deferral provisions. And these basically mean that rather than being forced to sell properties very, very quickly and maybe not at the best achievable price, it gives us a little bit of time where we can delay these payments whilst John looks at those assets he wants to sell and tries to obtain the best price for those. In the meantime, the fund remains open, so it continues to be priced, it continues to pay dividends, it continues to accept subscriptions, but those investors wanting to come out just have to wait a little bit longer. We were making very good progress with this process up until March, when we had the outbreak of COVID to contend with. We haven't seen any material uptick in redemptions as a result of COVID, so that's fairly positive. And as market liquidity does start to improve and John's able to move forward with sales, those payments to those redeeming investors will be recommenced. I'm not sure if there's any questions at this point, or if you'd like us to move on and deal with those at the end of the presentation.
Yes, please, if you don't mind, if we'll deal with those at the end.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to pass back to John now, who's going to talk a little bit about the asset management initiatives that have been undertaken, as well as a bit more on the ESG approach. So Jeanette, if you could move to slide 21, please.
Thank you, Kay and Jeanette. So yes, asset management. We just wanted to highlight here some of the positive impacts that we've seen from rent review negotiations, lease renewals, and new lettings. In the interest of time, I won't dwell on these for too long at all, but you'll see there as I go through these bullet points that we had one very successful lease renewal with Pets at Home, one new letting to Fira International in Stevenage, and then particularly 3 significant rent review uplifts, which secured additional income for the fund of about 561,000 per annum. As you can see, the office in Bristol was helpful in that regard with a 17% uplift, but the 2 industrial assets, one in Reading, one in Red Hill, delivered phenomenal uplifts of 39% and 44% respectively. These are rents that were set 5 years ago, so that's, it's not an annual increase, it's 5 years worth of rental growth coming through at that point. So I think we've got time perhaps just to move to the next slide and just really briefly touch on this redefined approach to ESG that I mentioned earlier. So nothing too dramatic here in terms of what you may have seen before, but we have simplified this to really kind of bring it down to 3 core pillars of focus. As you can see there, environmental excellence, health, well-being, and occupier experience, and then contributing to communities and society. And we take those 3 pillars to the next slide and build a specific fund strategy for ESG. I mentioned the net zero 2050 target there at the top. And clearly there's sections here within each of those 3 pillars that I mentioned on the left-hand side there. So I won't dwell on those too much. I'll go on to the next slide to remind you of a, maybe the next slide actually, another way that we measure our activities in the sustainability arena, and this is the GRESB benchmark, which is a global real estate sustainability benchmark. Main thing to focus probably on is the left-hand side, where you'll see they award this fund 4 green stars out of 5, and they rate the fund 5th in terms of the peer comparison out of 79 diversified non-listed funds. So this fund does particularly well in this regard, and something I'll be focused on trying to maintain and improve going forward. We are heading towards the end of our presentation. I'm very conscious of your time. We do have a summary slide that Kay was going to touch on coming up.
Very happy for you to do that.
Okay, if we could move to page 27, Jeanette. So just a brief summary of what we have said this evening. So John took over the portfolio in August, and we will be looking to appoint a deputy fund manager to provide additional support to John and the team. The strategy will be focused on reducing that retail allocation in the short term, and over the long term remains focused on income and maintaining the strong distribution yield, and also maintaining that high quality portfolio of assets with a very low vacancy rate and good tenant covenants. And the team are going to continue to work with John to continue adding value to the assets and mitigating risks. So very happy to take your questions now.
If anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask on the presentation that we've just had, I'll take you in order as you come up. Councillor Dorian, please. And Jeanette, if we could we please stop sharing the screen so that we have it? Thank you very much. Councillor Dorian, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So thank you very much, Kay and John. That was really quite interesting. And I just wanted to pick up on, John, if you don't mind answering the points that you raised. I was really quite interested about the retail side of things and how there's a moratorium on rents due to the COVID pandemic. And of course, a lot of people will have been worried about this fund because we know that there's substantial investment in retail. I just would like you to emphasise for the public's reassurance that those retail tenants will still have to pay that money at some point.
Yes, that's absolutely true. They are contracted to pay those rents. Absolutely. Once the moratorium is removed, possibly Q1 next year, we can take more forceful action to do that. I would just say, for sort of openness, that we as a house and as the industry is as well, actually, we are showing, I'm not sure the word's compassion, but we are working with our tenants to come to suitable solutions, which don't always mean that they absolutely pay 100% of their rent. There is some sharing of the pain going on in regards to the lack of trade that they were able to undertake during that lockdown period. So in some instances, a number of weeks rent-free have been agreed with tenants. One for good tenant relations, and doing good, and two, because it seemed a reasonable way to go, especially with the market as a whole adopting that approach.
Okay, can I come back, Chair?
Yeah, yes, of course you can.
Thank you. So, and that leads me to my next point, John, which was to ask you about your worry and concern about any potential recession, or dare I say it, depression next year, following from the COVID pandemic and the massive payments that this government's had to make just to keep people being able to buy food and pay bills. How does that feature, and would you be able to comment on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly it's a risk. It is a scenario that the economy performs quite poorly, and it has a very severe impact on the real estate portfolios. We're not modelling that into our forecasts at the moment in terms of our base case. We are assuming that the significant work that the government has done to reduce the impact on the economy of the pandemic will do its job to an extent. I mean, I think we're not expecting very strong real estate returns going forward over the next 5 years, probably something in the low single digits over a 5-year period, with some negativity at the front end and then recovery at the back end. But yeah, as I say, overall, that's not our base case scenario at this stage.
And so then, are you looking then, given the seriousness of the problem on the high street, and the fact that ordinary people more than ever are now shopping online, and I personally think that the average shopper will stick to online shopping much more than they ever thought they perhaps would. So how will that inform your decisions moving forward? Would you start to look to get out of more retail and into more places like Reading and Redhill, where you got this phenomenal return on your rental negotiation? Yeah,
I think that exactly goes to the strategy that I'm trying to adopt here. Yeah, reducing the retail exposure, continuing to hold that long exposure to industrial, which is the net beneficiary of this new format of shopping. So that goes straight to the heart of what I'm trying to do on this fund. We are coming from a slightly longer position in retail than I would like to be in. So there's work to be done there, definitely, which I'm on to. So watch this space, and we'll make sure we're working on that actively to bring it down.
Okay, thank you very much, John, and Kay, to you too. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Doran. I've got Mr. Sibley, Councillor Watson, and then Mr. Pickering, who I can see you've got your hand up there. I've got you noted down, Mr. Pickering. So we'll go to Mr. Sibley first, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mine's a general question, really. Property funds overall have created a little bit of nervousness amongst members, both councils I work for. And that nervousness has increased at the moment for obvious reasons. And quite often the comment that comes back to me is, why don't we cut our losses and sell up at this point? Now, my answer to them is fairly straightforward, that it's a long-term decision, this is, and as long as you're getting a return, now is the time to hold your nerve rather than panic. But I wondered if you could give some members some sort of assurance as to whether that would be your message as well, so they're not just hearing it from me. You can disagree with me if you. I've got no problem with that.
No, I mean, I could be accused of being biased, I suppose, but I would agree with that. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be a seller in a depressed situation. I would be sort of holding nerve and sort of seeing the market cycle through. I think I go back to the point that we've highlighted that the retail side of the equation is problematic, but we have a very strong portfolio on the industrial side. We have a very strong portfolio on the alternative side in terms of the rural portfolio, the student accommodation portfolio, and I think there's latent value, particularly in that rural portfolio, that I personally, if I was invested in this fund, I would hold out for in terms of enhanced returns further down the track.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Watson, please.
Thank you, Chairman. This question, I suppose, is again to John. And a very good presentation. Thank you very much. I'm just inquiring about what percentage of the portfolio is exposed to student accommodation at this time. And looking forward, is there a risk with student accommodation, because the nature of the pandemic we are in, that actually more and more students will be learning online and not in student accommodation? I was wondering whether you'd be able to address those issues. Thank you.
Yes, certainly, we'll do that. The exposure point is quite modest. It's around the 3 or 4% of the overall portfolio, so not particularly significant. I'd actually probably like to see it a little higher than that, but we're not actively sort of seeking opportunities right now for this particular fund. I think that situation that you highlight there, it has got to be an issue, has got to be a risk. The way we would approach this, and it's like a lot of, it's probably like the retail scenario as well. We would approach this by trying to acquire the best quality in the best locations, where we would feel that there will always be continued demand. You know, for example, our holding in Edinburgh, you know, I'm comfortable that we've got, you know, a very sensible holding there in a quality city. We'd be looking at the Russell Group university towns in general, towns and cities, you know, to continue that robustness of property.
Thank you, Chair. If I may come back.
Go on, Councillor Watson.
Interesting to see what was noted about carbon footprint. Are you tending towards being more of an ethical fund in relation to climate change?
I think it's going to be a balanced approach, I would say. I wouldn't badge us necessarily as an ethical fund. I think we will be trying to do the right thing. We will be looking to you know, meet those targets that I've outlined. There does have to be, you know, a commercial overlay to these matters, as you can imagine. So I will be bringing that commercial overlay to the opportunities that present themselves in terms of being able to maybe adjust assets to be more ESG friendly, carbon efficient.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I have Mr. Pickering next, please.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, may I say that it really isn't the time to panic, and I'd like to reflect again on what Mr. Sibley said. This is a long-term procedure. Both councils I've been involved with have had their panickers, but we're far better off with property bonds managed by professionals than trying to run an underwear factory, a hotel, or some other thing we know nothing about. My question to John, if I may, is the high street will probably never be the same again. The chances are our methodology of working with things like this meeting tonight, etc., may never be the same again. And there seems to be an underlying trend for people to look at these vacant buildings and say, maybe they'd make a nice block of flats. And there is a real need for housing that's not being met. Is this something that they would see as a threat to the market or an opportunity?
I would see it as an opportunity. We are very conscious of that trend that you just highlighted there, and it's one of the key things that we look at when we're underwriting assets. You know, what are the alternative uses that a site could be put to if it wasn't to be used for its current use, such as retail. And we are seeing, you know, in the marketplace, we are seeing assets retail assets, particularly I would say, Greater London South East, where there is that, that sort of the underlying value for residential, we are seeing very strong demand for sites such as those, even though they are retail investments at this current time. So I think you're right on point in terms of how these things are being looked at.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Pickering. Councillor Danny, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, John. Thank you for the presentation. I have one question regarding the investment, and I have one second question is a bit tricky. My first question is, if we do remember Corollian, the company which is doing the bypass in Lincoln, if we take it as an example, they declared a profit the year before, and the following year they went into administration. Now, and because of the pandemic and the situation we have now, and we have another lockdown, and I think the government, they don't know what's going to happen next year, but our Prime Minister stated a month ago that it could go until October 2021. I would like to have an assurance from Mr. John that our investment will be safe. That's the first question. Second question, which, as I say, it's a bit tricky. Surely every financial authorities or investors, they do have a bonus scheme for their employees. If I may ask you, are the employees of your company will still have some bonuses this year? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very, very good and challenging questions. Thank you very much for that. I think, the word safe, I think it's difficult to call anything, particularly safe right now. So, we are taking risk by being in an investment vehicle. And, I think typically, other than sitting in cash, we would be taking risk in other vehicles as well, or asset classes. So I don't think I can, give you that total assurance that you want, that it will be safe, but we are doing everything we can to mitigate the risks in the property portfolio, try to avoid, the weaker tenants that might go into that administration or liquidation process. As much as possible. I hope you saw from the presentation, that we have a low exposure to that at the current time, and that's something I will obviously try to maintain. I don't know anything about bonuses at this stage. That is decided in March 2021. So I'm afraid I have no information at all in that regard.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker I have identified is Councillor Alison Austin. Councillor Austin, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, John, and Kay, for your presentation. John, I'm possibly just slightly overlapping with Councillor Peter Watson's question, but I'm always very concerned about ethical investments. Mm-hmm. For instance, would you say that all your tenants, or you do your best to see that all your tenants exercise ethical practices? For instance, for example, in retail, for instance, a simple example is that a company doesn't employ, use or sell products that have used child labour in Far East countries, those sort of practices. I just wondered what your response to that is. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly do have a key focus on those type of issues. I don't believe we, taking your particular example, that we have taken it to that extent at this point. I think, we have been looking more at perhaps things like companies involved in munitions, for example, and that's something that we don't allow in this fund. So that would be an example I could think of right now. Something on an ethical basis which we're starting to consider is whether how much work we need to do on the living wage, for example. So, are the people that are working in our schemes on site, particularly, are they rewarded to that level as a minimum? So that's something else on an ethical ground. I think you can be assured that we're looking at. I think only recently we did a sort of a poll across our various fund managers to see what other types of non-ethical uses we do have operating within our portfolios. We took that to sort of things like, perhaps even betting shops and things like that. The outcome and kind of, tenants that do animal testing. And the answer was, we have very, very little exposure across all of our portfolios. And, I can't think of any exposure in this particular portfolio to tenants at that time. But we can do further reporting to you on that if you're very interested in that particular topic.
Well, I appreciate that it's obviously a very, very wide field, the term ethical, and I was just interested to hear your reaction. And I'm certainly very pleased with what you said, and it's perhaps because you are, when all said and done, a property company, it's property fund, it's less likely that you will than if you were actually investing in a specific company itself.
Yes, it's less likely, but the risk is there, but and we're looking to mitigate that.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have no further speakers indicated, so I shall just add for my Councillor Dorian, I'll bring you in before I add my own thoughts. Councillor Dorian, if you'd like to speak, please.
Thank you. It was just one last question. I had it on my notes and didn't get to ask John, and it was to look forward to a future meeting to ask you if you wouldn't mind to speak more on the GRESB mark. I've done a quick Google search, but I don't obviously have time to read it all, but I'd be really interested to learn more about that, please, John.
No problem. I'm happy to have a separate call with you and discuss that with you.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dorian. I was just going to add, for my part, that I'm quite reassured by the presentation and grateful for the presentation that has been given. And it's really interesting to drill down into some of those figures on how the portfolio is balanced. And I derive some of that reassurance given the slightly more limited nature of the exposure of this portfolio to retailers, some operating in this sector. Saying that, I personally endorse the comments of Mr. Pickering and others, Mr. Sibley, who have suggested that the whole purpose, reminded us that the purpose of these funds, these investments, is to look for the long term, not to make short-term speculative gambles on what a market might be doing today as opposed to next week. And it's also, I think, incredibly reassuring that the rules by which local councils are allowed to invest actively prohibit us from engaging in that degree of speculation and gambling. And I suppose it's more of an anecdote from my own readings and experiences. But I remember reading an account of a very old gentleman in the 1960s who was involved in land agency, recounting his experiences as an apprentice. And when he started at the end of the 19th century, the comments of all of his elders and betters and peers being that land and property was ridiculously overpriced, and there must be a crash, and it cannot sustain it any longer. And I think at that time, land was about £2.05 an acre. So I think there's there's an awful lot to be said for the course which has been set out before us this evening. The one thing I did pull out of the presentation and make particular note of is how you are achieving a 1.3% vacancy rate against a industry benchmark of 9%. And I have to say that given the state of the high street, and I suppose speaking here as a local councillor concerned for the state of the high street as much as for the state of a particular investment portfolio, it's quite reassuring that this particular portfolio isn't looking to board up extensive sections of high streets and retail properties around the country. But I'd be just interested to know if you could possibly flesh out how you're able to achieve that, which I think is a fundamentally good thing, simply because rent is clearly going to be more useful than a boarded up shop, but is also better for the retail environment as a whole.
Mm. Yes, I mean, I think the low vacancy rate and really does, I think, stem from the skillful management of my predecessor Dermot in terms of ensuring that he holds, or the fund holds, generally good quality real estate in locations that are still demanded even when they do become vacant. High Street Bath would be an example, which the fund has a significant holding there. And then also across the retail portfolio, we didn't touch on it at all in the presentation, which is remiss of me, but the vast majority of our retail exposure is in retail parks. With the car parking and the positive access aspects. And we found, particularly in this sort of COVID world that we're in, that they have bounced back much more quickly in terms of sort of footfall and sales compared to your high street and your shopping centres, particularly. The fact that they're open air, and as I say, you can drive to them much easily, and you can socially distance on a much sort of easier basis. So I think that's one other reason this fund has stood up quite well. It's got that high proportion of retail warehousing exposure.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very helpful explanation as to how that's arrived at, and I think it's a credit to yourself and your predecessor that this particular fund, this particular portfolio is able to achieve that. I don't have any further speakers indicating that they wish to ask questions, so appreciating we've spent a considerable period, a good period of time discussing this. I think at the same time very useful and important that we have spent that time to go through your presentation. I'll thank you very much, both Ms. Rowell and Ms. Acast, for your presentation, which I think has been very helpful and useful for members of this committee. And thank you very much for your time with us this evening, and look forward to catching up with you again in the not too distant future.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all very much for your time as well, and good luck with the rest of the meeting.
Thank you very much. That moves us on to item 2 on our agenda, which is the Monitoring Officer Conference and a verbal report from our Monitoring Officer, Mrs. Sachs. Mrs. Sachs, if you would like to give us your update, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Last week I attended.
Thank you very much. Just to say, if there are
is someone trying to speak?
Is there someone out there trying to speak?
I think it was Mrs. Acast saying thank you and let me know if there are any further questions following the meeting.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. Michelle, are you all right to carry on?
I am certainly okay to carry on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last week was the annual Monitoring Officers Conference, which unfortunately had been delayed from the summer due to COVID, and then had moved to an online conference, again, as we're all online at the moment. And I thought it would be helpful to report back to the Audit and Governance Committee with an update, particularly around the emerging draft code of conduct as produced by the Local Government Association. So I'll do a quick run through it. As I say, there's no report because at the time the reports were printed, I hadn't actually attended the conference, and it makes sense for a verbal update. And if you would like a more detailed, well, I'm going to suggest that we have a more detailed report come to the next Audit and Governance Committee, because by then the code will have been published. So the code is likely to be published in early December. And this is going to be the final code following another series of consultation throughout the summer on a draft code that was prepared following, again, further consultation at the beginning of the year. So I'm going to just go through some headlines from that in terms of key points to think about. The draft code that is being produced, and actually does now exist, as I say, it's just not been published yet, has got all party support at the LGA and all sector support. So it's seen as a very strong code designed to improve ethics and probity in local government. During the consultation period, the key headlines of activity related to a debate between should there be respect or civility contained within the code, and further aspects to be included in the code include equalities, social media, when acting as a councillor means acting as a councillor, disrepute, and the need for an accompanying guidance document to support interpretation of the code. In terms of the respect versus civility, there was a lot of debate around this aspect during the consultation period, because it was considered that civility wouldn't be properly understood by members of the public, and actually what was simply being sought was respect. And this is to include both respect for the office and the role, as well as the individual. And that's seen as particularly important for parish clerks. So you'll be aware there's approximately 10,000 parishes and town clerks across the country. And actually many of the issues that often come to involvement of the monitoring officer are where the clerk is suffering due to effectively giving proper advice, and there is either a lack of appreciation or understanding about the role of the clerk. And that often, from experience and from fellow MOs across the country, we see that translate into relationship deterioration between the principal, between the parish and town council and the clerk. And there is often employment tensions within those situations, again, because as you know, at district level and county level, the council is vicariously liable for the actions of individual councillors. So there has been a steady increase around the employment disputes that exist, that unfortunately do arise from allegations of bullying and harassment. So respect will be in there, and respect will be pretty much as set out within the draft code at the moment. I've got the draft code that I can pull up if anyone's got any specific questions around what's currently in there. But as I say, that's not the published one that will come out in early December. It's the existing draft upon which consultation was undertaken. Turning to the equalities aspect, you will know that I have been concerned for some time that we don't have direct reference to the public sector equality duty within our existing Boston Borough Council code, and that actually in today's world that is essential in terms of not just the 8 protected characteristics, but ensuring that as local leaders, members are clear that they uphold the standards and principles of the equality duty. As part of that, there's going to be further differentiation between bullying and harassment, and the distinction between bullying and harassment within the code, and that comes back to better understanding what the impact of the equalities section will be. In terms of social media, again, this is something that I've spoken to at length regarding a failure on our code at the moment, in that we don't have provision for social media within our code of conduct. This is considered to be an essential criteria to a new code, because again, from when the codes were first introduced back in 2011 with the Localism Act, social media was not as prevalent as it is now. It's further being picked up during the consultation period that the impact of virtual meetings has also increased the need for understanding in the code to explain what that means in terms of how members conduct themselves within both social media contexts, but also within the field of the virtual meeting as well. And it's also looking for greater need for local protocols and guidance to assist members on what those boundaries may be. The acting as a counsellor has always been an interesting aspect, and it goes right back to case law involving Ken Livingstone that many of you will be aware of. I've spoken often during my years at Boston and before there are other councils around what that particular case did in terms of setting out context for when a counsellor is acting as a counsellor or not, or acting in a private capacity. And there's been, again through the latter consultation, a real demand for clarity, and that the purporting to act as a counsellor does not provide the clarity required in modern life for counsellors. And I think if I can give an example, I've often spoken around when you are in a supermarket, and the issue for members is that you are always, if you go into your patch and you go into your supermarket on a Saturday morning, there's a very strong chance that somebody will see you who is one of your constituents and say, now I've emailed you and I haven't got a response, or I'm really unhappy with your response. And this is the question of, when are you conducting yourself as a private individual and when are you conducting yourself as a counsellor? I think some of you will recall the advice I've given on a few occasions, that actually if you are in a supermarket and you're with your family and you're in a private capacity, the simplest way of dealing with that is to say, that's great, I'm not at work at the moment, I'm not in my counsellor capacity. If you could send me a quick text, then I'll pick that up when I'm doing my constituency work. And that straight away sets the boundary. And the situation is, there have been cases, in years gone by, not involving Boston, I hasten to say, where counsellors have been in that position and they've been acting as a private individual, but they've started someone has approached them, they've started a conversation, and that conversation has got very heated and then has led to a complaint. And the question has always been, if the counsellor then started to discuss council business, i.e. ward matters, they were then putting themselves in a position of being a counsellor at the time then the complaint comes in. Whereas if you'd been able to say, I'm not on my council business at the moment, but drop me a quick text or send me a quick email and I'll pick it up at a later on today or tomorrow, whenever that might be, you have set that boundary down. And if that conversation then became argumentative or adversarial, actually you've set a marker in the line to say you were not acting as a counsellor. You made it very clear you was in your private capacity. There's been a couple of cases over this last year about what amounts to acting as a counsellor or not, and and one particular example involves a member of the licensing committee who was out having a drink in a pub within his council area, and he consumed too much alcohol and seemed to be drunk and disorderly, and the publican ejected him from the pub. He was asked to leave. And as he was being ejected, he said, I'm a member of the licensing committee and I'm going to have your licence revoked. Now, the case was upheld to say that in that capacity, even though the councillor was clearly in his private capacity because he was out drinking and socialising and clearly not on council duty, as soon as he invoked his council status by saying, I'm a member of the licensing committee and I'll have your licence revoked, he put himself in the position that he was acting as a counsellor, and the code was then triggered and he was then subject to an investigation under the code, which he subsequently was found to have breached. So there's that kind of example that really does need clarification. I've always been really clear with you what that means. But again, it's something that I think would be helpful to have set out in our code, and certainly in an accompanying guidance document. Disrepute is another section that's going to become a section within the revised Code of Conduct. And the example for this is that needs clarity, because at the moment there isn't any clarity as what disrepute means. So therefore, there will be a better definition of what disrepute means. And it's also intended to catch issues that members of the public do not understand, why a councillor is not in breach of a code of conduct, of a member code of conduct relating to their behaviour, and that relates to such things as criminal convictions and housing benefit fraud. And again, when we've had training sessions before, I've alluded to benefit fraud. At one point, as a few years ago, there was about 7 councils through England and Wales, through England particularly, because Wales has a slightly different scheme. It does still have a sanctions scheme, but in England, where district councillors had been convicted of housing benefit fraud against their own council, but because it wasn't caught by the code of conduct, there was nothing that there was no comeback for them as a sitting councillor. And whilst they may have been expelled from group and then were sitting as unaligned independents, there was public concern in the system whereby you could be committed of defrauding your own authority and still continue to sit as a councillor. So the disrepute section is anticipated to include aspects around that type of behaviour. There's been another recent case as well, and this has gone to the heart of Article 10 and the freedom of speech. So again, I'll just give you some headlines from that, and I'm more than happy to send any of you a link to that if you would like, and I'll put that in the wider briefing as well if members would like. When there is a particularly freedom of speech often arises when there is a question of respect. And as you know, at the moment, the Boston Code is lacking in any reference to respect, and that creates some challenges for behaviour in terms of not having that category of mutual respect. And as I've said, that will be a section that will be contained within the new code. And what this case has set out is that we always need to consider Article 10, particularly when there are cases of disrespect. And you look at, is the comment made as a councillor? Is it a personal abuse, or is it personal abuse or a political comment? If it's personal abuse, it's likely to amount to disrespect under the code, and Article 10, freedom of speech, will not be engaged because it's simply considered disrespect. If it's considered political comment, then there is a degree of protection in what's called enhanced protection in making that statement. However, that comment must be proportionate and reasonable, again, set in the previous case of Heason. And one of the things that's been quite clear in the case that's come out this year, which is a case called Bunting, and is a Northern Ireland case, but provides good law for England, is that gratuitous personal comments will not be protected under Article 10. In respect of moving on to sanctions, as you will recall from the draft code, there is provision for informal remedy, which is called local informal resolution. And there is a series of local remedies that are designed to be put into play as part of the introduction of the new code. And I'll just run through those quickly as a reminder. They include an informal discussion with the monitoring officer or appropriate senior officer, an informal opportunity to speak with the affected parties, a written apology, mediation, peer support, requirement to attend relevant training. If it's of a serious nature, a bar on chairing advisory or special committees for up to 2 months, and where of a serious nature, a bar on attending committees for up to 2 months. Where serious misconduct affects an employee, a member may be barred from contact with that individual, or if it relates to a specific responsibility of the council, barred from participating in decisions or information relating to that responsibility. So, as I say, what I'm proposing to do is, once the new code, I mean, we've got the sections of the draft code and they aren't likely to change. As I say, there will be tweaks to some of the language within there. And the example is civility is now replaced by respect as a heading. And I'm proposing to work with the member development group and this committee, and involve the standards committee, to organise individual member training for each of the sections contained within the new code. And I think that's pertinent and helpful because there is a lot of change to the proposed new code, under the code that we have in Boston. And I think rather than try to do a training session that incorporates all of those changes and the nuances and the impact on individual members, in a 2-hour session, that's going to be a huge amount to take in to account. So therefore, I think it would be helpful to have a series of training sessions that focus on those individual sections, that enables real debate to take place about what they mean, what that might look like, and really get your views as members as we move forward into adopting that code. And that's something I'll be discussing with the member development group, which I think is either next week or the week after. It's very soon. I think we've got the chair of the member development group here tonight through Councillor Austin. But as I say, and I'm also looking to include a wider range of providers. So I'm in discussions with the LGA to support some of that training as well, and also other public sectors, just to give a real spread and make it an interesting programme of training to pick up the quite significant changes that are appearing in the new draft code of conduct. There was a couple of other aspects. It was a really good session at the conference, and there was another. There's often an update from the Society for Clerks Society for Clerks in Local Councils, and they represent the 10,000 town and parish councils, along with obviously we have NALC, which is the National Association of Local Councils. And they're very keen to see training high on the agenda for clerks. Equally, just as I see issues come before me where there's been a breakdown of relationships between a clerk and their parish, I also see the reverse, where the clerk is not as proficient as one would hope. And I've seen throughout, as again, many examples during my 20-odd years of being an MO, being able to see many examples of where clerks sometimes have not taken advantage of training and therefore are not giving the best advice to their parish councils and town councils, and that can lead to conflict as well. So it's really good to hear that the SLCC are really pushing the requirement for training. I know when the report for ethics in local and probity in local government, which was produced by the standards, the Committee for Standards in Public Life, getting on for a couple of years ago now, 2 years in January, the clerks have been really keen to see a mandatory requirement for training of clerks because they felt it was really essential. But the Committee for Standards in Public Life didn't feel they could mandate the training for clerks because they thought it would be operationally too challenging and would actually create a vacuum of trained clerks, which actually would cause more problems for parishes than solve some of the issues. So the concession was that there is a really active requirement to attend training, but it is not mandatory. So that was it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was a very quick run through about really to just flag up the emerging changes to the code, as I know that the Standards Committee had decided that they would wait until such time as a draft code was imminent before the discussions on the code took place again. So back to you, Mr. Chairman, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sachs. Incredibly exciting times that we're living in with this. Having been part of discussions on this council almost since I arrived here a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, around updating our own code, what is the best system within which to do that. I'm delighted that the Local Government Association has put in the time and effort that it demonstrably has to come up with something that has broad support across local government across the country, broad support across parties, broad support across sectors. Because it's one of the ridiculous things about local government is when every council has to come up with its own interpretation of something, and you end up with literally dozens and dozens and dozens of councils running around trying to work out what code they can tolerate politically, what code that they feel works for them, and entering into, I mean, a whole rainforests have died in the process of councils trying to work out their code of conduct. So I think this is delightful that the Local Government Association has decided to do that. And I know the last time that we met, as well as our Audit and Government Committee here, we have the subcommittee for standards, which include representatives from the parish councils and a parish clerk on there as well, in order to be properly representative of those councils that depend on us for their code of conduct themselves. The last time we discussed code of conduct here in any depth, we would inform that the Local Government Association were going to go away and do this, and we paused our own independent efforts in anticipation of what of the Local Government Association getting on with it. So the fact that they have done, I think, is really, really good. And at the same time, my understanding is that the actual consultation on the draft code closed a few months ago. So I don't think now is the time for us to be piling on the suggestions for how we might want to change or modify it. It's more a case of waiting and seeing what is published. And for my part, I would be absolutely delighted if you would come, if as soon as that the Local Government Association have announced and publicised their final version, that we bring that to this committee as well as to the standard subcommittee for review, in order to progress potentially to the next stages of that. It's absolutely right, in my view, that that respect is a core part of what we all do together. Anyway, I'm conscious not to go on too much, appreciating that we have quite a lot of agenda ahead, and Mr. Pickering has been waving at the camera. So, Mr. Pickering, if you'd like to speak, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Like you, I'm pleased to see the Local Government Association have come up with what I hope will be a nationally accepted code of conduct, and a huge waste of time and effort in producing single ones for every council in the land. I guess the same issue that the Committee on Standards in Public Life addressed applies to both local councils, parish councils, and even members of Parliament, that unless you break the law to the point where the police become involved, you really can't square the circle that if you're elected to represent constituents, you can't prevent them doing so, and therefore punishments are limited. And there's this sort of grey area between you need some training, you need to go and apologise to somebody, you've committed a breach of the code, but you're not going to call the police in. And in that area, there's just, you have to get on with it, and nothing can be done. And it is a regret that there isn't some form of redress for somebody who does breach the code, sometimes quite blatantly, but it isn't serious enough to warrant police intervention, and yet it's too serious to warrant a smack on the wrist and a bit of training. There's nothing you can do about it. It's a regret, but that's life. Thank you.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, there is still ongoing discussions between the LGA regarding formal sanctions. Those of you who may have been councillors before 2011 will recall that there was a sanctions regime, for want of a better word, which we're picking up your point, the grey area in between, Mr. Pickering, where there was the ability to be suspended or disqualified. And again, there are still discussions ongoing around those types of sanctions, and particularly how the role of the local government and social care ombudsman could be part of the appeals process, so that if there was a formal suspension of a member following a finding of a breach of the code of conduct in serious cases, and that's the comment made by the local government and social care ombudsman, that it is considering how it could form an appeals body for such situations. I think the concern is that nobody wants to see a return to the former Standards Board for England, which became literally inundated and in fairness swamped principally by parish council complaints. They took up at 1.67% of all the caseload that the Standards Board for England were operating, and therefore the more serious district and county council complaints got lost amongst some of the less serious issues that were being complained about at parish council level. So there is some real regard to how that can be managed in order to mitigate the impact of including those 10,000 local towns and parish councils, but equally being able to uphold a robust and transparent process that gives ethics and probity within local government.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any point that they wish to raise? Appreciating that this will come back once the Local Government Association code is published. Councillor Austin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Michelle, very much for that. Whether I am or not on the Council Development Group is questionable, as I wasn't intending to continue on it, but in my current role as chairman of that committee, obviously I welcome this. I think you, Michelle, are aware of some of my feelings. And interestingly, though, thinking back to, say, about 12 years ago when I was first on this committee, one of the big problems was whether or not there were any sanctions, but the length of time it ever took for a decision to be made. And it got to the situation where it was so long after the event, then it just wasn't worth doing anything. So let's hope that if there is a need for any action, then it is relatively timely and not sort of a year or more after the event. Anyway, thank you. I have nothing else I need to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Austin. I don't see anyone else indicating to speak, so I'll say thank you very much, Mr. Sachs, for a comprehensive update on that conference and some really useful, informative, exciting news from the Local Government Association side of things. So thank you so much for your time presenting this evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to now leave committee. So thank you very much and good evening to every. Sorry, unless Adrian was particularly wanting me to stay for an item. No, in that case, Adrian, I'm off. Good night, everybody, and enjoy the rest of A&G.
Thank you very much. That leads us on to item 3, which is the audit completion report for 2019-20, which is pages 9 to 34 in our papers, and a report by Mazars, the council's external auditors. And I understand that's Mr. Surridge, is it not?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
I'll hand over to you to take us through that, please.
Thank you and good evening. I will take the report as read. There's a few things that I do want to just bring to your attention. The audit completion report summarised the work that we've completed on the 2019 financial statements. As members will probably be aware, there's been an extension through to reporting timetables as a result of the impact of COVID-19. The first thing that I wanted to say is something that is particularly important. The impact of COVID-19 has had a significant and tremendous impact on your finance teams. The burdens they've had to do on top of the day job and producing a set of financial statements has been a significant challenge, and I don't think it can be underestimated. And I do want it to go on record before we even get into the report that we do express our sincere thanks to the finance team for the work they've done. What I also hope that you'll see as a result of this report is actually, it is a very good report. There aren't particularly any real issues in terms of the financial statements. They are pretty clean. The only matters that are actually national matters that are reflected in your accounts, and that is a good result for the council's finance team. The work is substantially complete. It is also fair for me to say that it has stalled a little bit in the last couple of weeks. The audit manager involved has unfortunately been on a medium-term sickness absence and is hopefully back in the next week. That has just put some last-minute pressure on us to make sure that we take this audit through to be able to complete by the 30th of November. There are very few adjustments in the financial statements. There's very few adjustments coming out of our work, and there's no unadjusted statements that I need to bring to your attention. The two aspects, well, the one aspect that I do want to draw to your attention and do talk about is that through the report, you will see that the significant audit risks were unchanged from what we set out in our plan. But COVID-19 has had an impact on the valuation of land and buildings and investment properties. Earlier in March, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors issued a briefing note that suggested that because of limited data, because of COVID-19 shutting down both markets and construction, that they encouraged the professional valuers to declare that there may be something called material valuation uncertainty over the fair value of land and buildings and investment properties. It is very, very clear that that material valuation uncertainty does not detract from the fair value of the carrying value in the accounts. The value in your financial statements is still the best estimate at the year end. It is fair to say that COVID-19 is unusual and therefore requires a small disclosure in the accounts just to bring that to attention. That approach is consistent with all local authorities as well as any organisation that carries assets at fair value, and therefore whilst it is unusual compared to last year, I would also like to give you some assurance that it's not unusual for this year. What it also means is that we will incorporate what's called an emphasis of matters paragraph in our opinion. It is not a modification to our report. It is not a qualification or anything of such. All it does is just rightly draw the reader's attention to the disclosure note in the financial statements to say that this material valuation uncertainty exists. At this point in time, we are still outstanding the assurance letter that we need from the pension fund. There is a high probability that that material valuation uncertainty will extend to the property assets held within the pension fund. The council must account for its share of those assets in your financial statements. And therefore, there is a high probability and an expectation that the financial statements, the material valuation uncertainty disclosure in your financial statements will probably reference the pension fund assets as well. We can't conclude on that until we get the letter. And again, I would reiterate, it does not mean that the valuation is incorrect. The valuation in the accounts is still the best estimate that it is at the time. It is just that COVID-19 has created such uncertainty across financial markets that it is right just to express that and disclose that in the accounts. In terms of our other responsibilities, we're also responsible for issuing the value for money conclusion. Again, we are issuing what we call unmodified, which is a clean value for money conclusion. We will conclude that the council does have adequate arrangements in place to secure the economy, efficiency and effectiveness. We do reflect on COVID-19. It is, in our view, a 2020-21 issue, not to 2019-20. And that is a particular reason why we will be issuing an unmodified conclusion. We do reflect in our report that obviously the short-term impact is being managed by the local authority. However, the medium term and the impact on your medium-term financial planning is something that will be subject to continual review once further facts come out in terms of funding as well as the broader economic environment, will continue to have an influence as you work through in preparing your and approving next year's, as in the 2021-22 budget. It's an area that we will take particular interest in as the months develop, and we will be reporting back to you with that next year. That's all I'm going to say in terms of the report, and I'm more than happy to take any questions from members.
Thank you very much, Mr. Courage. Are there any questions on this report? And I see that Mr. Pickering has his hand up, so I'll go straight to you, Mr. Pickering.
Thank you, Chairman. I actually propose that we minute a vote of thanks both to the officers and to Mazars for actually getting this job done in the extenuating circumstances we all face.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pickering, and I'm very happy to second and endorse that. I think it's very interesting, a very useful presentation, and a very interesting and thorough report. And I certainly echo Mr. Pickering's comments. I mean, the two paragraphs which I think I would draw committee's attention to would be on page 15, sorry, which is the audit conclusion, and that is that our audit procedures have not identified any material errors or uncertainties in the financial statements or other matters that we wish to bring to members' attention in relation to management override of accounts. That strikes me as a pretty good, clean bill of health. And furthermore, on page 30, on the conclusion there, that on the basis of our work, having regard to the guidance on the specific criterion issued by the Comptroller and Auditor General in April 2020, we are satisfied that in all significant respects, Boston Borough Council has put in place proper arrangements to secure economy, efficiency and effectiveness in its use of resources for the year ended 31st of March 2020. And I think that just builds on my remarks in respect of page 15, that it is a clear bill of health for this paper, not of course withstanding the comment that we just heard in the report in respect to the effects of COVID. I don't see anyone else wishing to speak on this. I mean, I'm very happy to formally second Mr. Pickering's vote of thanks, and if I see no one wishing to indicate a speak or speak to the contrary, I'm very happy to accept that and to take that as carried. And just add, to say my further thanks for your work in what have been clearly difficult circumstances. I don't see anyone else indicating to speak, so I will take that that vote of thanks as carried and the report noted. And thank you once again for your time this evening, both presenting the report and previously in putting it together for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If there's anything else that you'd like to add, by all means, I'll invite you to do so. Thank you. That moves us on to item 4, which is the internal audit update, which is pages 35 to 50 of our report papers, which is to be given to us done by Mr. John Scott. And I'll be very pleased to hand over to you and to present that for us, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll start off on the introduction page. Sorry, I'm just reading from an individual report, so I'm just not on the not exactly sure of the exact page on your agendas, but it's the it starts with the key messages. The draft internal audit plan for 2021 came to the Audit and Governance Committee on the 27th of January. Due to COVID and following discussions with the then Section 151 officer, we agreed to reduce the resources on the audit plan to 75% with a corresponding reduction in the fee, and to commence work on the 1st of September. The revised plan focuses on core financial audits and other key areas, including COVID assurance, and including our combined assurance work, which will still enable us, internal audit, to provide our annual internal audit opinion at the end of the year on governance, risk, and internal control. So moving on over the page, in terms of key messages, we've altered our coverage to address the risks presented by COVID. We will continue to employ our combined assurance methodology, looking at assurances from both management, third-party performance, and internal audit, as well as external assurances, so we can give that rounded assurance at the year end. In terms of work in progress, we've got 4 pieces of work on the go at the moment. One is the alliance governance arrangements. The focus of that work is looking at the memorandum of agreement, and also against some LGA good practice. We're looking at some COVID assurance with managers and assistant directors to see what issues and changes were caused by the initial lockdown, and what mitigations have been put in place. We've got NNDR risk-based audit, and we've also got an ICT security assurance audit, which is a follow-up of work from a previous year and detailed review of IT security arrangements currently. In terms of internal audit recommendations, I'll come to there is a separate section on those later in the report. There was a couple of high priority recommendations which I mentioned there. The business continuity and emergency planning recommendation has actually now been completed. Over the page are one piece of work that was is being reported this time is around the decision-making process for car parking fees. There are a couple of pieces of work which were discussed at a previous meeting with audit committee members, and the process for approval of car parking, the decision-making process around car parking fees or the suspension of those was an area that was requested as a management request. That was discussed with the Section 151 officer, and we looked into that. So the decision to reduce the car parking charges between March 2020 up to date was supported by the approved charging policy at the time, and the relevant officers and members were involved in the decision-making process in accordance with the policy. So we looked into all the arrangements for that. There was some actions that were agreed to improve the control environment in that area. The reporting back to Cabinet on the 9th of September as part of the quarterly performance risk and finance report did take place, but management agreed that further detail would be required in the following meeting and moving forward. As a further measure, future decision notices would include the financial implications of the decision. Data on free parking wasn't available until the 7th of August due to technical issues, and so a more informed review would take place to extend that further. And officers will also consider a mechanism for all decision notices to be reported in their entirety retrospectively. And that process should ensure that reporting back is always to the next available Cabinet meeting. Over the page, some other matters of interest. One around the code of conduct, which the monitoring officer has already covered. Something around COVID-19 fraud risk, which Audit Scotland have put a few points together. I'll just go through those in a second. The National Fraud Initiative, so all local authorities are now uploading data for the National Fraud Initiative work, which benchmarks data across different councils and other public sector bodies. Ombudsman complaints over the page, they were providing some additional guidance for complaints handling. Cyber attack, one of the councils up on the northeast had a significant cyber attack, and that was just to highlight the need for ongoing vigilance regarding cyber security. And the Audit Scotland guidance for audit and risk committees was just to bring to attention some of the issues arising from the COVID pandemic around internal controls, financial management, governance and risk management. Appendix 3, audit recommendations, provides a breakdown of all the outstanding and completed internal audit recommendations across a range of the audit activity that we've been completed. I appreciate that with the COVID pandemic, officers obviously have had to prioritise a number of things, but the Chief Exec recently had asked the managers and assistant directors to ensure that there was focus was maintained on ensuring that any outstanding recommendations are completed as quickly as possible. In terms of Appendix 4, the 2021 Audit Plan Progress Report. So as well as showing progress, that shows the audits which were in the original draft internal audit plan and which are going to be deferred probably until 21-22. The new audits that have been brought in are COVID-19 assurance, decision-making processes, which was around the car parking, and the new strategic alliance, which was around the governance arrangements. As I say, we've maintained the focus on the financial audits this year, and we're still retaining the combined assurance work, as well as ICT. So happy to take any questions, Chair, on that report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. I will invite speakers in order. I have Mr. Pickering, then Councillor Dorian. Mr. Pickering, please.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Scott mentioned the issue of cyber attacks. I was very concerned to hear at the start of this meeting that one of our members has not got the relevant upgrades to his council system. As an ex-IT professional, one of the best defences against cyber attacks is upgrading the latest software wherever possible, and I think that's something that should be looked into. Secondly, about the decision making and over the car parking, appreciate the governance issues, but I think there are times when too much governance just delays decision making, and certainly examples at the national level in the current pandemic are fairly widespread reported. The last thing is a question, code of connection regarding IT. I don't really know what that means. Be enlightened, please.
A code of connection is really a code which sort of sets out how the council will manage its arrangements or with external contractors and partners in terms of access into the council systems or onto the council's network.
So that, if I may, that would include things like firewalls and limited access to various parts of the systems, etc.
Yeah, it really sort of sets out the expectations of the council in terms of anybody accessing the network. It could be, obviously, contractors will need to get onto the council's network at various times to perform routine maintenance, etc. And it kind of it's one of those things which sets out how that will be undertaken, but in a more formal manner.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Dorian, please.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I'm going to agree with one thing Mr. Pickering said, and I'm going to disagree with another thing that he said. So if I start with car parking, I was one of the councillors that was really hot on this and really wanted to follow the train of thought. And it was really difficult, Mr. Pickering. And as a councillor, as a very intelligent woman, I struggled to actually find how this decision had been made, who made it, when it was made, and what was taken into consideration at the time. And the decision notice is published on the website, but it's tucked away at the very bottom of a page that was very difficult to locate. So for the average consumer, the average council taxpayer, I felt this was inappropriate. And so I did speak with Mr. Sampson and emailed with him, and he was very efficient following up, and I'm grateful to him for that. But it was not about the fact that we were giving away £500,000 of taxpayer money, potentially. It was about how the decision was being made. And that deserves good governance. That deserves good oversight. It deserves to be made in public, in consultation. And it very much was not. and I'm still quite aggrieved about that. So I am pleased that that this is part of your report. The bit I do agree with you with, Mr. Pickering, is around the cyber attacks. Now, I happen to work most Saturdays and do my marking on a Saturday, and I was actually the member of staff that found the cyber attack at Haven High Academy, and I watched as files disappeared in front of my eyes. And I felt a little bit like the man on Boxing Day with the tsunami who couldn't do anything about it. He knew it was coming, but couldn't do anything about it. It was a horrible experience. And of course, our council could be very vulnerable to that, as you say, if councillors don't update their devices in good time. But I would like to see that followed through, Mr. Scott, and to know what measures we are taking as a council to mitigate against any cyber attacks. I would like to say on the Alliance governance arrangements, I'd like to, I've not been super impressed by how things have developed in terms of our scrutiny of that, Mr. Scott. And so I would encourage you to speak to elected members when you do that audit, because I think you'll find they may have a lot to say. And lastly, around the code of conduct, please indulge me, Chair. I didn't get the chance, well, you did give me the chance, I didn't take it. Around the code of conduct, I would like if I could have a copy of our response to the draft code of conduct. We did have meetings set. We were going to meet as councillors. All that evaporated. I have no idea why. Councillor Noble's here. Perhaps he'll share why he let that evaporate. But I would like to see what our response was to the draft as a district council. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Scott, would you like to pick up on any of those points, please?
Okay, right. Well, in terms of IT security and cyber security, that's very focused in terms of the work that we're going to be doing very shortly with officers. So I think we're going to be covering that off hopefully in the near future. Obviously, we're looking at the Alliance governance arrangements. As I say, the main focus of that is around a review of the memorandum of agreement, just to look over that to see if there's any points that need to be raised in terms of that, and also looking to benchmark against the LGA's good governance document within for those types of for that type of joint working and partnership. Our scrutiny as part of the Alliance governance, that's one of the areas that we're going to be having a quick look at. So I'll take that on board. And I think that was. I think the other area was the code of conduct, which was the monitoring officers area.
Thank you very much. I have 3 speakers. Ordinarily, I go to the next speaker in turn, which would be Councillor Danny, but I have Mrs. Sibley who would like to come in, and I see that Councillor Noble, the portfolio holder, who have responsibility for this area and formerly had responsibility as chairman of the committee, has indicated. So, Mr. Sibley first, please.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to help John out a little bit, because it's not John's role to look at some of the questions that was asked there. It's John's role to look at the controls we've got in place. So just in answer to Councillor Dorian's points, what I'll do, I'll get the IT manager to forward her a list of what we think the mitigation things that we've got in place for a cyber attack are. And I'll also speak to Michelle to ask her to forward, when appropriate, a copy of the response to the draft code of conduct. I just didn't think it was right that John picks those up. I think it's something I'll pick up separately from the meeting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sibley, and that is muchly appreciated. Councillor Noble. Actually, it was very remiss of me, Councillor Noble, not to formally welcome you at the beginning of the meeting. I didn't realise that you were sitting there on the camera, but welcome. It's good to have a portfolio holder join our meeting.
Well, if you recall, Chair, we did talk in the past when I was Chair of Audit Governance Committee, how it would be a good idea for the finance portfolio holder to be in attendance. So I'm very welcome to be an attentive guest. Now, I'm going to remind Councillor Dorian what happened as regards the Code of Conduct. At our last full meeting of Audit and Governance, this is before the lockdown, we had a meeting in which she and members of her party were present, and by an overwhelming majority, people voted that they indicated that they like to keep our existing minimalistic code, awaiting the LGA's draft code. Now, I think every member had a possibility to access that code, look if they want to. I certainly did. And what pleased me, that it was not overly prescriptive. I thought it was absolutely ideal. And so I think we have to await the final draft, or the final version of it, which is going to come out, I think it was said in December 2020. And we'll, if it's like their draft code was, the original one, which was back in about July, it was absolutely fine. Because in my view, the less prescriptive, the better. And I think Councillor Dorian took the same view at that last meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Noble. I'm very keen that we don't slip back into debating the Code of Conduct at this point, because what we're looking at are the control measures that we have in place on our internal audit processes. So I shall go on to Councillor Danny, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question, I have two questions, and I think, sorry, as a council, have we been a fraud target lately? If so, for how much money, if we have been to? And the second question is, I would like to know what's the measures taken. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Scott, is that something that you, or Mr. Sibley, something that either of you could pick up?
I will defer to Mr. Sibley, but I'm not aware of a fraud target. The Boston Borough Council have been a recent fraud target for cyber attacks. Obviously, cyber attacks affect every council every day, and councils are receive hundreds, if not thousands, of attacks which are deflected and defended through the various software mechanisms that we've got each day. In terms of the measures taken, I think that goes back to the last point which Mr. Sibley was mentioning, which he's going to respond back to Councillor Dorian in terms of the control measures for, or the key control measures for a cyber attack.
Chair, if I may come in as well?
Of course.
Yeah, I think the question was around fraud as well, wasn't it? Not just cyber attacks. It was around fraud as well.
Correct.
I don't know of any fraud attacks. If there have been any, they're under the radar. So they're obviously good attacks, but then fraud attacks generally are. But I'm not aware that there has been any, either successful or unsuccessful. In terms of controls, this is something that John does every year. He looks at our income areas, he looks at our payments areas, and there's a whole host of measures that he looks at every audit that takes place every year in this. I mean, John will know more about these than I do, but it's things like segregation of duties. They'll do a sample of testing, that type of thing. John might be able to explain more, but I can assure you that these areas, because they're high risk, are looked at every single year, and they're always in the audit plan.
Thank you. Can I come back, Mr. Chairman, before John goes on? The reason I asked this question, because we have heard about a lot of frauding going on during the COVID-19, especially the financial ones for businesses and companies. And that's probably, for me, is more financial. Thank you.
Yep. I think what you're referring to is the grants that the councils up and down the country have paid out to businesses who are supposed to be in hardship. And some councils have done this very differently and just paid out without minimal checks. Now, I'm not aware that that has been the case at Boston, but I am aware that there will be a full audit of the grants process that we've gone through. So if there are any instances, it will be highlighted then, hopefully.
Thank you, Andrea.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Councillor Noble, I'm very reluctant on account that we're, is this something that you can answer? You're not supposed to be asking questions of the portfolio holder. Is this something that you can answer?
I'm about to enlighten you, Councillor Ashton, and fellow committee members.
Go on then.
With reference to fraud, I'm no intention of asking questions, but there was only one instance, this is according to Paul Julian, our previous S151 officer, of a local business being wrongly given £24,000, and the recipient knew that it was inappropriate because that particular person wasn't an owner of property, merely paid rents on the property that was used, and that money was paid back within a day, and that is the only instance of a mistake that the council made.
Thank you, Councillor Noble. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Noble, for that update, and I think that in its own way is incredibly reassuring. But at the same time, it gives further reassurance that there will be a full audit of all of the payments that were made at that time, which will, all being well, reinforce what you've just said and give further a further degree of confidence to members of this committee and members of the council more widely. I don't see any further speakers on this item, so I would just add my own thanks to you, Mr. Scott, again for the report which has clearly been produced and work which is clearly ongoing. I think it's evident from appendices 3 and 4 just how fluid the work that you're doing has had to be in what have been has been and will continue to be quite challenging times. So thank you very much for the report that you've given. Thank you to yourself and Mr. Sibley for your answers to members' questions. And I think I will conclude that item there, seeing that no one else is indicating to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Which leads us very neatly on to agenda item 5, which is the draft statement of accounts at pages 51 to 164 of our papers. And I'll hand over to Mr. Sibley, our section 151 officer, who will present the report, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think I'd like to start by introducing, for those of you who don't know him, Tim Sampson. On my screen is in the top right-hand corner, but I don't know where he is on yours. But I'd like to thank Tim as well, because I can't underestimate the amount of work that goes into producing this statement of accounts. It's a 100-page document. Mark alluded to this earlier. It's an extremely long-winded process. Essentially, the document is something that is written by accountants for accountants. I hope Tim won't mind me saying this, but it doesn't mean too much to the average man in the street because it is so far heavily prescribed in how it's presented. And legislatively, it's dictated to us what we put in and what we don't. The purpose of it is to highlight several things. One is the annual governance statement. Secondly, is to show that the accounts are a true and fair view as at the 31st of March. And thirdly, that we are providing value for money. Now, because it is heavily prescribed and it is a technical document, it's difficult for councillors to go through what is a 100-page document, pick out key points and challenge officers on it. So the mechanisms available to councillors for this are, firstly, the report that Mark presented earlier, which was quite glowing in terms of what officers had done and what was being presented in the accounts. Secondly, you are reliant on myself as well to say that it represents a true and fair view and that I can't highlight any significant issues from it. Based on the fact that Mark said that it's an unqualified opinion and that we are achieving value for money. So the only things I can draw you to in the report that may be of interest to you, rather than spending half an hour going through them, which I'm sure you don't want me to do, the key things that can come out of it is that we have a £50 million budget in the council and we spent within that last year. We also have reserves that are over £30 million and they've risen by nearly £3 million last year because of capital receipts that we've got. it leaves the council in a fairly strong position compared to a lot of councils up and down the country. There are challenging times ahead, but there are challenging times for every council up and down the country. Boston is no different to pretty much all of those, and is in a far stronger position than most of them because it has got this base of reserves. So that's all I can say, unless members have got specific questions. And part of the reason for introducing Tim is that he's here to answer all those difficult questions that you may have. So I'll just quietly pass the book over to Tim there. But what I would like to do is ask the approval of members to approve the annual governance statements and the financial statements, and therefore the letter of representation that we're asking the chair and myself to sign. Mark has already alluded towards there may be a couple of changes through circumstances beyond our control, but so long as those aren't material, we're asking for approval to sign off the accounts in the future. That's it from me, Chair, and I'm happy to let Tim take a load of your difficult questions now.
Thank you very much, Mr. I have Mr. Pickering, then Councillor Dorian, please.
Thank you, Chair. Two things. First of all, when I first started on audit and governance, I attended a training course on understanding local authority accounts. And the two key issues with that were, first of all, read the notes, because that tells you most of what you want to know. Secondly, if you can't find any huge variations, put your hand up and say, looks all right to me. And I think in this case, that's about where we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pickering. Councillor Dorian.
Oh, thank you, Chair. That was a very good summation, Mr. Pickering. Thank you. It was just a question for Adrian. I missed the number. You kind of broke up there. The amount in reserves, please, Adrian.
Thank you, Chair. So we've currently got 13, well, as at the end of March, 13.349 million in reserves. That's split between capital reserves and revenue reserves. And that's improved from £13.3 million last year.
Okay, thank you very much. And so if that was a proposal from Mr. Pickering, then I would second it.
Thank you very much, Councillor Dorian. That is noted and appreciated. Councillor Watson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question relating to what Mr. Pickering just said a minute ago. I had already highlighted on page 145 the remeasurement gain and loss regarding return on plan assets excluding the amount included in net interest expense for 2018 and 2019-20. One is 2.7 million, and the other is nearly 5 million in the minus figure. Can someone please help me with that range? Thank you.
Could
you just tell me the page number on the statements, please? Because I'm not working from an audit pack.
Oh, sorry. In that case, it would be page 89. Is the other number at the bottom of the page? It's under the reconciliation of movements in the fair value of scheme plan assets.
Could you give me that again, please, Councillor Watson, the actual number concerned?
Numbers concerned are on the table at the top of that page.
Yeah.
Reconciliation of movements in the fair value of scheme plan assets. Yeah. The actual numerically, it's the third numbers down from the top, which are remeasurement gain or loss in return on plan assets, excluding the amount included in the net interest expense, where we have for 18-19, 2,725,000, and for 2019-20, a deficit of nearly 5 million, 4,966.
Again, as far as I'm concerned, that's just the magical work of the actuary, really, in the year-end valuation on the pension scheme. So we take those numbers straight off the pension scheme valuation.
Okay.
Okay. Provided by Hyman's to us in the annual report.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Do you have any further questions, Councillor Watson?
No, I don't, Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I have no further speakers indicating on this item. I have it moved by Mr. Pickering and seconded. Oh, I have Councillor Austin, Councillor Alison Austin. You'd like to speak, please?
I can unmute myself. I'm assuming that Councillor Noble won't now, at the bottom of page 82 or 26, whichever you're looking at, won't now be signing as Chairman of Audit and Governance. Just a minor point. As you know, I'm a great one for spotting those sort of typos. Or would he, because he would have been Chairman on the 30th of September 2020. So who will actually sign that?
Chair, if I may, I think it will be yourself, Chair. I think it's the report, just the document might just need amending for that. So thank you for pointing that out.
And on a similar vein, was there any reason why we're going to approve it twice on the very first page, on page 51? Or again, have I missed something? Okay. In the recommendations, that is. I seem to have got exactly the same thing twice, and I wonder whether I'd missed something.
I would say you can never be too careful about these things, but as far as I can understand it, we are only approving it the once.
Yeah, could you just explain?
I'm sure once is sufficient, thank you.
I think what Councillor Austin was simply referring to is a typo effectively on page 51, which is the recommendation. However, I have it moved by Mr. Pickering that we approve the financial statements 2019-20 and annual government statements for publication, Appendix A, if no adjustments are required as a result of the ongoing audit by Mazars, and that the chairman of the committee and Section 151 officer sign the letter of representation as Appendix B.
I will second that.
I already have it moved by Mr. Pickering and seconded by Councillor Doran, but thank you very much.
That's fine, perfect.
And I will ask Jeanette to take a roll call vote on that, please.
Thank you, Chairman. If members could indicate whether they're for, against, or wish to abstain. Yourself, Chairman.
For.
Councillor Alison Austin.
For.
Councillor David Brown.
For.
Councillor George Corner.
For.
Councillor Anton Danny, Mr. Mayor.
For.
Councillor Anne Dorian.
For.
Councillor Frank Pickett.
For.
Councillor Peter Watson.
For.
And I'll also record that Mr. Pickering is in favour. Is that correct, Mr. Pickering?
It is indeed.
Thank you. That's unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Jeanette, and thank you in particular to Mr. Sibley and Mr. Sampson for your report, for the work and for the extensive pages that have gone into this. And as I say, thank you very much for that. I think it's always a sign of a good report if, to pick up on Mr. Pickering's remarks, members can't find any irregularities in the figures with which to pick holes. So thank you very much for that. That's greatly appreciated. And that neatly links us on to our final item of business this evening, which is agenda item 6, which is the Audit and Governance Committee work programme for 2020 to 2021. I would just add my own remarks on this, following on from the report from the monitoring officer earlier. It may be necessary to add in at some point the Local Government Association Code of Conduct when that has finally been released. And I'm also mindful, as we discussed earlier, that we have a subcommittee for standards which will need to meet in order to evaluate and take that forward, as well as ourselves in audit and governance. And I'm very happy to work with Jeanette and the monitoring officer to establish whether we can fit this we can fit an item onto the 25th of January for an additional update, or if it is a substantial piece of business that we will have to do, I'm entirely content to have a further meeting if it's felt necessary to give proper debate and proper scrutiny, not only to the code of conduct that we hope to consider, but also the 7 items of business that we already have scheduled for January. Does anyone else have anything else that they wish to raise for the work programme? Well, seeing no one indicating to speak, if anyone does have anything that they believe to be pressing that they would like us to consider including in our work programme, please do get in touch with me as chairman, and we will endeavour to do what we can to accommodate. I think it's absolutely right and proper that we have full and effective scrutiny of all of the items that come under the auspices of this committee. That then brings us to the end of our business this evening and the end of the meeting. I would add my particular thanks to everyone that has participated, particularly representatives of outside organisations that have been here this evening and presented, as well as officers and people responsible to the Borough Council for your presentations as well. And incredibly grateful to the portfolio holder for finance, Councillor Noble, for taking the time to be with us here this evening, and again to add answers to members' queries when you've been able to do that. So I shall declare the meeting closed and wish you all a very best of the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you.